don't think long and hard about it, where the thinking's going on. So like you think a little bit, and you're like, oh, I got it, and then you think, how do I work and across my worldview? And that's, if they do any thinking, it's like, how do I make other people believe this, rather than, wait a second, is this the most correct way? Does this mesh with all the other things?
Yeah, it seems like a taxi cab fallacy almost, right? It's like,
Okay, welcome back. We are in our last week on gender and sexuality / Christian response to it, or what should be the Christian response be. I think most of the folks here were here last time, so I will not do any kind of major summary, but basically to say we had talked through the reasons of basically grounding of the viewpoints, and then said, depending on what your grounding is, that will dictate your viewpoint to some degree. And then we had gotten to the point where we were asking the question of whether things occurred on a spectrum, whether things occurred in some sort of binary view. One thing we didn't say last time on this, and I'll use this to kick off the discussion that was going really, really well last time, right up to the point where we had to leave. I think that you can be, if you want to be overly exacting about things, there's almost nothing that you can't make things that are normally binary into something that isn't. There are very, very few exceptions to that kind of rule. And what I mean by that is, if you're writing binary code, or you're coding things in some sort of base 2, you might say, no, there's only 0 and there's only 1. To which the clever electrical engineer might tell you something like, well, but the state between the two is not discrete. It runs, your wave runs this way, and then it curves up, and then it curves this way, but there is no true square wave in electricity, in electrodynamics. So it's not really binary, is it? So that's the kind of thing you can say, and you can say that about anything. Now, I'm not arguing. I might say that we can say that a little bit about male and female. Look, there are two states here that we generally recognize. Yes, there are going to be differences between the two. Not every man instantiates all the properties that we want to say are ones that we typically consider male. But one of the things that we have to do in a discussion like this is be very, very careful about what properties we assign to maleness, to being male, and what properties we assign to being female. And then we also want to remember that although God is called he in the Bible, and the angel of the Lord, as an example, is referred to as he, when Jesus is asked about this marriage question in post-resurrection, he says, you're displaying your ignorance to the questioner, and says, when after the resurrection, men are not, and women are not given in marriage, but are not, male and female, they're not marrying, they're like the angels who are in heaven. So this implies that the angels do not have a sex. And I think it's also, even though we refer to the angels typically in he, whenever they appear in the Bible, that's a term of convenience. It's a function of the language. And so the thing is probably true about God, And God does use imagery occasionally. Remember what Jesus says when he looks at Jerusalem. He laments over Jerusalem and says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I have longed to gather you under my wings as a hen gathers her chicks." So he uses a female image to indicate his feelings towards this city and this people. Now, I don't think he's saying, "Therefore I am female." What we're saying here is, are the properties, when you go back to the very, very beginning of where this division, at least in a Christian viewpoint, comes from, in the beginning, God created man. In his own image, he created them, male and female, he created them. So is it the case that both male and female are in the image of God? And the answer from that verse seems to, the default is clearly yes there, and so you'd have to make an argument why you think that's not the case. So nowadays, when we say what's male, the list of things that are male are going to include, the really masculine stuff is, hunting and motorcycles and beards and muscles, and you got this popular. This is really manly, and here's this other stuff that's really feminine, and there's a mix in between, and people get confused because now manly may be really good at pulling espresso shots, wears thick-rimmed glasses, has a beard and a top knot, and suspenders are on point, or on fleek. Thank you. The language is changing over time. I'm not keeping up. So if the picture of what it is changing to be a man, so to speak, changes according to your age, you have to ask the question of, have you baseline what's truly masculine and have you not? I don't know that I'm certainly not a fan of this guy, Jordan Peterson, in that I don't think his religious viewpoint is anywhere near close. But I think there's an explanation for why he is so popular nowadays, and that explanation is in this arc of this is what it is to be a young man today. There's a feeling, there's a backlash against some of this pull of popular culture into a different direction, and he's at least speaking to these young men because his message is basically take responsibility, like make your bed in the morning or something like that. He's not saying you have to be a biker guy. What he's saying is a man is somebody who is of character, who stands up, who does these following things. The truth is, that's the same is true of ladies, too. To be a good woman is to do these things as well. But what he's trying to do, he has some appeal because he has a semi-traditional message that may indicate that we're pulling a little bit in a different direction.
I've heard a lot, like, when I hear the arguments of gender versus sex, a lot of times it seems the way people are describing gender is just kind of what you've just been talking about, is the masculinity versus femininity, rather than, like, it's personality traits rather than, because those are obviously subjective traits and created by society in some way.
Yes.
So Matt, can you, I don't know if you want to talk about the difference between that, like the masculine femininity versus the actual gender?
Right, and I think that's a great question. So when you're saying, this was our question that we posed originally, does gender equal biological sex or not? Now let's put a few statements out there and then evaluate them and see what they inform us of. When someone says, I really like playing rugby, do we say, all right, well is that more a male trait or a female trait? Is playing rugby more male or more female? Now, someone might say, well, that's kind of a male sport, but then the clever person will say there's an awful lot of ladies rugby teams, and so why is it that we're saying that? And then if you think about it for a while, what you might say is this. Well, let's take sports that are, let's say, not traditionally male and female, but let's go to fairly egalitarian societies where they encourage women's participations in sports. There's as little cultural prejudice as you can get, and you say, what sports do each gender, sex, typically draw towards? And what I think you find is that the more aggressive sports tend to attract men. The less aggressive sports, when I say aggressive, I mean physically aggressive. Now, that is not a rule at all. I've watched some ladies who are awfully feminine off the pitch, absolutely level people on the field. In fact, Monsieur's, one of his daughters, I was doing summer camp, and I underestimated her prowess and nearly ended up on my rear end. in a sharp lesson of like, don't have any prejudice when you're on the soccer field. I don't know. I think when you look at things like music, and you look at this kind of heavy metal crowd, you go to a heavy metal concert and you say, what's the proportion male to female of people in here? And you'll find this overwhelmingly dominant overrepresentation of men. It's highly aggressive. The kind of dancing they do is circle and pit, knock into each other. It seems a little bit, and I would call it way overdone. It's a caricature of masculinity, and it almost looks violent, and so it's tempting to say rough sports, rough music, violence is a male trait. Do you, typically speaking, statistically speaking, and I need to find the citation because I'm sure it'll be controversial, it's my understanding based on the data that when it comes to, let's be careful on the term domestic abuse, what I mean is when a male and a female who are in a relationship with each other, married, living together, whatever else, who resorts to physical violence more frequently? The answer is ladies do. Ladies hit men at a greater rate than men hit women. Now, those numbers typically aren't captured because when typically a lady doesn't do as much damage to a man when he hits her. And not many men are going to be like, my wife hit me, let's get the cops in here, for a whole litany of reasons, right? Some of them may be I was uninjured and it just made me angry. Some is that I would be ashamed to admit that my wife trounced me. It might be any of these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, women actually resort to violence interpersonally more than men do, statistically, from a survey perspective. Well, it's accurate or not, the function of the survey. But it is not the case that violence or aggressiveness is necessarily a male trait. And yet we seem to see that correlate strongly in sports and music that seem to have those same properties. So the question now is that a male trait? Is it not a male trait? My initial take on this part, which is only one tiny bit of your question, is this. On average, men are stronger than women. Part of the value of being a man, in a society like this, that strength delta, significantly less relevant, right? We have all kinds of tools, from large lever bars to hand dollies, that make a woman's capability to move furniture around the house, a woman and a tool, way more effective than a man trying to lift the furniture himself, right? You see that on the 1995 arm lift thingies, I forget what they call them, the straps that you can carry furniture around with. The forearm forklift, there you go. Two ladies can lift more than three guys with the forearm forklift or whatever they claim. So in societies where that's not the case, this difference in strength emerges and the value of the individual increases proportionally. So if it's the case that you have a long endurance, strong, far-sighted, athletic, capable guy, he's going to hunt successfully more deer in buffalo than the guy that can't do that. And the guy that can't do that is going to end up being valued for things in the society that women can do as well. So you see how this gradation is going to settle out a little bit. In a medieval feudal society, where the strongest knight is going to be the most manly man, and the cut line there, where a man is no more valuable at defense or martial endeavors than a lady, he's going to kind of get typed in the society as being valued for the same things a lady's being valued for. And for that differentiation, you might say, well, okay, that's why we have a sliding gender scale. The question is this: should that be the way that we evaluate the value of people in society? I would say no. You don't evaluate. One man is not a better man because he's a stronger man. And we see that in our society coming up, and then I'll get to you two real quickly. In the society, Albert Einstein, Robert Oppenheimer, Richard Feynman or whatever, these are not the manliest, strongest men out there, right? Operating a yo-yo apparently exceeded Einstein's capability, if popular legend is to be believed. So, and I don't see him lifting heavy weights. But you put those minds together, and what do they produce in the Manhattan Project? More wartime destructive power than anybody's ever built before. So this starts to change a little bit some of the value of people in society, and that's why I think even today you don't see quite as much a pull towards those kinds of things. Now that's just an initial step at starting to answer the question, but at the end of the day, what I think you can say is we as Christians ought to first decide what are male and female properties, if there are such things, and what are the values by which we should grade people on their maleness or femaleness. Now on the biological sex idea, that one, if biological sex means the sex that a creature has that allow it to reproduce, that ought to be completely non-controversial. So when someone says that has X and Y chromosomes, I am a woman, that is a biologically clearly false statement, because the biological statement says a male of a given species, of a human species, has an X and a Y chromosome, and then you may further say something like that, can reproduce sexually with a female. Now obviously you can't make that a hard definition, because what happens if you have a guy who's infertile? Or does that mean he's no longer male? Of course not. You would still say he's male. So really, you might want to go back to a genetic code to say people who have this part of a genetic code equal this sex. People who have that part of a genetic code equal that sex. But this is why I'm going back to, it depends on your definition. If your definition is genetic code, then to say that is false. If what instead you mean is this, there are a set of properties out there that our society calls female. There are a set of properties out there that society calls male. I value and believe I instantiate more of the properties that are in the group female than I do that are in the group male. Therefore, I wish to identify as a female. That now starts to make a lot of sense if you're not talking about sexual reproductive capability. Now, the reason that people get upset about that is they say, well, fine, do that, but then why do you participate in sexual activity on this other side of the court, so to speak? Why are you pretending to be a woman when in fact you are a man? And the answer is, in my opinion, is this: society has valued me, values certain things. I instantiate the things that society values that are female, therefore I identify on this side. And tell me it's not the case that there are men, like this guy talked, who had some what society called effeminate traits. And so society, and maybe even religious people, pushed him into the, well, if that's what you're like, then you must be one of these, Ben. And he was like, okay, if that's what you're telling me, maybe I need to be thinking about that. And he starts thinking about it, and he starts thinking about it more, and then he starts doing more. And now he's off down this path to the point where his return may be almost impossible to this other side. And so he takes some neutral position of being a celibate gay man type of idea. This, in my opinion, has to do with what people value rather than with what actually is inside their own body and then ultimately their own mind. All right, I think Brian, Katie, and Peter all had hands up. Brian, okay, Obi, yes. Wisdom, sir, wisdom.
I don't think you can uncouple societal gender expression from nature versus nurture. And that is a whole nother can of worms that I don't know if we want to go down. But I think really the question isn't what is gender in society. The question is there a moral component to gender?
Yes.
So that matters. And if not, can't we just erase gender and go with biological sex?
Clarify what you mean by there's a moral component to gender.
If there are a set of expressions that God has deemed appropriate for the biological sex female
Yes.
and inappropriate
Yes.
for the same one.
Yes. Okay, good. Let's discuss this for a minute and then go to Peter. And then Brian, if you want to chime back in with whatever, good, by all means. Does God have, let's ask this question. Let me ask it a little more colloquially, although we need to get to as general a question as yours is. Does God have certain roles he wants certain genders to play? Okay, let's ask it that way. Biblically speaking, what does it look like? Well, it's certainly the case that at a minimum, in certain societies, father, mother, yes. But let's say that's just a de re automatically. If you father a child, we're going to call you a father. It's certainly the case that in gender roles, he wants women to carry. It seems he wants women to carry the babies and men to not. Yeah, from an equipment perspective, that seems to be the way that it's working. Now the question is, all right, fine, she's carrying the baby. Does that mean so you go to parts of Afghanistan, and the pregnant woman is in the fields doing her field work the whole time while the guy's not working, and the tribeswoman is walking from one position to another. She's It's time. She squats down, has the baby, picks him up, and keeps walking. And you're like, holy smokes. All right. Apparently that's what human beings are capable of, but I'm not going to tell my wife that's the way that she ought to do it. Yeah, come on, let's suck it up. You should see what she did. No, that's well, a lack of wisdom on my would be. Is it the case that due to this equipment type of issue, that therefore there are roles? Well, consider the difference in society. Back in a society where there is no breastfeeding is the only way to keep your baby alive. All right. If that's the case, and Mama's one of the few females around and the only one capable of breastfeeding, then if any activity she's not doing when she should be breastfeeding impacts the health of the infant, increased infant mortality rate, all that kind of stuff. So at some point you say it's the guy's job to go out and do it, and we see that in nature. The mom's taking care of the babies in the nest or whatever, dad's going out hunting. The female wolf's in the den, male wolf's out hunting and brings it back. And when he brings back the food, if you haven't seen this or read about it, the male brings the food back, and what does the female do? Does she say thank you? She snaps and snarls at him and will bite him if he gets too close. Why? Because she's protecting the pups in case he decides he was going to eat one of them. So now hopefully that's not the way your own household works, but at the end of the day, there's a role that is informed by equipment in nature. That same role seems to be appropriate here until you get to a society where that's no longer necessary. So, which, by the way, we're living in now. There's absolutely no reason that a woman can't have a baby, hand him over to the father in today's society, and the father can keep him alive, keep or her alive. If not as well as the mother, you can argue whether there's some other component there that's important, but it certainly can be done, and is done. So now does that mean, with the advent of technology in different societies, that the gender role is no longer valid? I think you can make a case for that, for part of that. Now the question is, what does God want from each of these people for the child? You have to consider the following. When God made man in his image, if he also made woman in his image, that means that when he made man in his image, the reason that he made him male had nothing to do with the fact that God was male. So it's not like God made man in his image, and the man needed a helper, and he's like, okay, well, I'll make something that's quasi in my image, not exactly in my image. We'll set it off a little bit differently, equip her differently, and she's like, Adam's a 10 out of 10 in my image, and Eve's a 7 out of 10 in my image. That's not what the Bible seems to suggest, at least by my reading of it. So it's, while some people do seem to treat it that way in Christendom, that's not the case, as far as I can tell. So you have to say the value is equal, the roles are different. Now, what are the roles? The roles go back to purpose. What's the purpose of each one of these people in the family? You can turn to, let me prove this. When the Bible describes an ideal woman, or at least a place where we talk about where the wisest man ever to live is talking about what a great woman is, or a wise woman is. This is his characterization, or this is King Lemuel who says this, King Lemuel. Who can find a wife of noble character? And wife, by the way, in case you don't remember the etymology of this one, wife simply means woman. It's just another word for woman. So when someone says, this is my wife, it sounds a little barbaric, but what you're really saying is, this is my woman. And it sounds a little chest thumpy, but when someone says, this is my husband, husband actually kind of means like farmer and caretaker or whatever. It's another word for man. She's just really saying, this is my man. This is my man, this is my woman. Who can find a woman, a wife of noble character? She's more precious than rubies. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will lack nothing of value. Is that true the other way around? Yes. She will bring him good and not harm all the days of her life. Is that true the other way around? Do you see what I'm doing here? Yes. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. So she selects wool and flax. That's kind of a business thing or a homemaking thing. In a business perspective, the guy might do that too, and works with eager hands. Both of them are diligent, you would hope. She is like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. So she brings home the bacon here, right? That's an interesting idea. Isn't that supposed to be a guy thing in some of our modern society, or at least in the recent past? She rises while it's still night to provide food for her household and portions for her maid servants. Okay, so she's diligent and willing to work, and she's the principal steward and caretaker of her immediate set of property. The guy might be said to do the same. She appraises a field and buys it. Wait a second, who's doing real estate deals here? Mama. And her earnings, she plants a vineyard. Wait, I thought farming was the guy's job. What's she doing here? She girds herself with strength. Oops. And shows that her arms are strong. Wait, I'm sorry, are we describing the guy or the gal here? What just happened? And she sees that her gain is good and her lamp is not extinguished at night. That means she didn't run out of oil. Her wisdom has kept her well supplied. She stretches out her hands to the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. That is to say, she works to supply the needs of her own house, maybe. Opens her arms to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. I thought that was one of the things that a man was supposed to do in chivalry. The code of chivalry is to be doing these kinds of things, to give alms to the poor, to be generous. When it snows, she is not afraid for her household, for they all clothed in scarlet. She keeps her kids in the right gear. She makes coverings for her bed. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known at the city gate, and he sits among elders of the land. What that means is he's a well-respected man, which obviously she's a well-respected woman here too. This can be said the other way around. You don't want to. If your husband would want his wife to be well-respected. Now this one may be role-specific of like, okay, wait a minute, does this mean that he's involved in governance, societal governance, and she's involved in domestic governance? All right, maybe, let's keep that as something in mind, but look at all the stuff that she's doing here in the meantime. Strength and honor are her clothing. Strength and honor, I thought that was a watchword from Gladiator. Strength and honor, right? The guys are saying that back and forth to each other, not the women, but strength and honor are her clothing, and she can laugh at the days to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. Well, I thought guys were the dispensers of wisdom, and that's why guys are supposed to be teachers in the church and all that other stuff. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband praises her as well. Many daughters have done noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting. Here are properties that he does not consider to be key womanly properties. Charm and beauty. Now, pick up any glossy magazine today, and they are only ever concerned with these things. They're not concerned with any of this stuff. That should tell you something. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. A man who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands and let her works praise her at the gates. You see the purpose of what I'm doing here, right? And you might ask the question of, well, with a woman like this, who needs a husband? Right? Now, that is not a bad question. And that, in fact, is the way that I see it. In a proper relationship between a man and a woman, the division of responsibility goes by the particular giftings that each has. Both of them had better be diligent. Both of them had better be wise and economical and far-seeing and strong and principled and have character. You don't do things as though one person is of great nobility and the other person just doesn't have as much nobility, so we'll put them in this subsidiary role. That's not how it works. But yet that's the impression we give ladies sometimes. That's not the case. This woman, to quote the Pride and Prejudice thing, is a fearsome creature, and I would not, if you find one like this, that's an amazing thing. The same can be true of a man who instantiates these properties, right? Almost everything in here you could change to he, and no one would be offended. And that's important. So this does paint a picture of a woman who's managing a household. And the picture of the man, as brief as it is basically like he's running around jabbering. He's not working he's sitting in the city gates. That doesn't sound like he's really busting his butt to do much here, because she's the one who's taking care of the household. Is it the case that God has created women to be people in our society and our society's, well, let me ask this question before I go down this road. What is a society's fundamental unit? Matter is made up of elements are made up of molecules. Once you break those molecules apart, you no longer have elements, the way that periodic table elements. You now have atoms. excuse me, once you break the atoms apart, depending on what the molecules apart, you get atoms. Now you're in the periodic table. Once you break those atoms apart, you get subatomic particles that are interchangeable into these atoms. So the configuration of the atom, note this, the configuration of what we call some of our most elemental structures dictates, it's not the parts that they're made of, it's the configuration in which they are that dictates the properties that they have that are of use to us. So I don't know that God meant that to be a lesson, but I think it's interesting. Is it the case, what ought to be the fundamental structure of a society? Is it an individual? Is it an individual if it's a society, it can't just be individuals. The fundamental unit is an individual. Okay, that's not, maybe you could say it must be comprised of individuals, but where do we go from protons, neutrons, and electrons to things that have differing properties and roles? Is it the individual or is it some other unit?
So I read in college, I can't remember who the famous writer was, but he's like some kind of scientist or something, but I was supposed to read it and I was like, oh, this is not anything to do with science. About household, city, and how everything starts from the household and how that comes into the different types of society.
Yep.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
It's probably too general for me to know, and maybe I'm not very well read in this subject. So,
This is like the word household is used.
but let's say that's the case. So why? Some people might obviously leading us into an answer. The answer here might be a family unit as one of the molecular units or the atomic units of a society. Is that right, or is it something else?
I'm not sure if I would agree that family is the most fundamental unit, maybe in part because God first created two individuals, and then he created a family, and then later a society. So I wouldn't want to dismiss that an individual could be a fundamental unit of a society. Otherwise, you'd have to say an individual is like a degenerate form of a family, or, something about that seems a bit amiss to me.
All right. So no, I want to agree with that. So I posed the question in a way that should have led you to this answer. The individual is the fundamental unit of a society. That's the base level. Once a person's arm, if you cut off somebody's arm and lay it there, you don't say that's a member of a society. But when you have a human, even you have the person without the arm, that's a member of society. So it's actually the individual's mind and will. Those are individual parts of society. Now, once we have a mind and will, and we want to build a society by definition is more than one. When you start having multiple members in there, they will have relationships of some sort. What relationship is the next form of a relationship that is the most beneficial to that society?
Well, and certainly I would agree. It seems that you're pointing to there is a gender nature to that relationship, not only a sex, like a physical sex-based difference, but there does seem to be a gender difference.
Whereas gender here are properties that we ascribe to being part of one or two or more genders.
Yes, maybe a way I could say it is there seems to be, if you make a distinction between is versus ought. So we've got some societal is what does God say ought. There seems to be some performative aspects to physical gender as prescribed in Scripture. But there are some things that seem suggestive of a similar thing like that to me, not only within the church, but at least in the case of Israel, in the governing of the society. That seems gender-based as well.
No, it certainly is. What I'm trying to get to eventually here is, are the gender roles that are described and codified by Moses roles that's the way it always ought to be, no matter what the society is, or these are roles that, given that we're in this kind of society for this many hundreds or thousands of years, this is the way that it ought to be. So let me quibble with something you said earlier. You said God created man and then woman, and then he created them, and then he created a family. What about saying the following? When God created a man and a woman, he created a family.
I think the way Genesis talks about it says a man was created, a woman was created, he brought the woman to the man. So there was a time where they were both distinct individuals and not joined. So
Yes.
there does seem to be a state of individual and then they bring them together.
Yes, so I think that that's the case, but the second that they bring them together, they are a family. Right. That we're bringing together here means he puts them in a relationship that has a certain set of goals and intent. It has purpose to it. The purpose of this relationship. Now, what's the first command that he gives them? What's the first command that was issued to Adam and Eve? Yeah. So, and I don't think that what that means is, all right, well, if you don't have kids, then you're not doing what God said to do. That's, this is a general order type of idea. It could be, yes, it could be, but and also fruit tree planters, farmers of some sort. Okay, yes, and both, and you better know how many fruit trees you have. So if thank you, Peter, thank you for enriching the discussion. Let's say then, for just to cut to the chase a little bit, we acknowledge that they're individual. The atoms of our society are people, and specifically minds and wills. Those people can be instantiated in a couple of different types of casings: a male casing, a female casing, and in those, does the fact that you find yourself in a casing indicate that you have a role? Now, I will ask you this one. Forget male and female for a second. You find yourself, and let's pretend it's our society today, not the society of God's society. We'll say just our society today. And you find yourself in the position where you are 6'4", 250 pounds of twisted steel, and you can run 100 yards in 8 seconds. And can a human being do that? 9 seconds, whatever it is. And you can lift, twice your weight and all this other kind of stuff. What is, and on the smart side, yeah, you're average to below average intelligence. What is your role in society? Or better this, what's not your role in society? Maybe being a cutting edge mathematician or theoretical physicist. Maybe that's not your thing. Why? Because there are other people who are going to do that better than you. Does that mean you can't do it? What stops you from being a mathematician? Be a mathematician if you want to. Will the society value you more? Will the society tell you, you are a good contributing member to society, we're going to pay you money, to do this job? No, you're not going to get paid to do that job. You might get paid to play football, be a construction worker, coach a sport, teach mixed martial arts. There are a whole bunch of things that you might do, but notice what the fact that you found yourself in this casing is going to mean that society is going to pay you to do certain things. And specifically, this society is going to pay you to do things that at least our society believes is going to maximize the value that you bring to the society. That is to say, we're going to invest money in you for 10 years. Are you going to come up with the next not Nobel Prize, but Fields Medal in mathematics, or are you going to entertain people in an arena? Which one of them is more likely to be useful to you? Are you going to be useful to society? So probably the latter, but the problem is this: should we be paying people to entertain us in an arena? Is that the best use of our money? Is that what's going to make a great society? By the same token, on the math side, if you figure out how to do Ricci flow with surgery to solve this one problem, does that enrich society? And it seems to enrich this tiny, tiny circle of like 23 people who understand what the heck that just meant. And it's impressive when you put it on the front of a newspaper, but people forget about it 2 seconds later. Does that enrich our society? So let's say then that our society's dictates for what your role will be are probably wrong. Okay, what society is going to value you for based on the body that you're in and the brain that you have, and remember, brain and mind are not the same thing if we're right about kind of that construct here. The brain that you have and the body that you have, your society is going to tell you it's valuable if you do these following things. It's valuable if you fit these following roles. The society is probably wrong about that, because one other quibble: did God build the society that we live in today?
Well, when I said society, I was referring to building of Israel.
Okay. Yes. Now let's say the societies that came out of the garden, the society God built was the garden. And then we left that one and started doing things on our own. So even the society in Israel is a society that is not God saying this is the way it's supposed to be in the long term. What he says is, what it seems to me he's doing is, this is part of the repair work to get us back to the place where we can do the kind of society that I want you guys to do. So I don't think that one turns around and says, as it was in ancient Israel, so shall it be in the future in heaven. Now, some of that seems as though it will be that way, and some doesn't. So I ask all these questions to not directly answer any of the questions that have been posed, but rather to have us think about what is it that is that we need to consider when we're trying to value these things. The reason that so many young people today are confused, I think, about are there more genders? Should there be more genders? Is there at a place in our society where they're asking a legitimate question? Is what our society is telling me as a young man that I am valued as a man if and only if I instantiate maximally, or to what degree I instantiate these following properties: strength, aggressiveness, the ability to earn money at the following sets of jobs that we call men's jobs: construction, shrimp boat fishing, go down the list of things. And so young men who find themselves in a body that is not conducive to that, or they have grown up in a household where they don't see that. And I'll give you a great example, just in general, and this is a typical explanation of how some people in the nurture side, how is it some people get towards choosing a homosexual lifestyle. Picture this as a possibility. What if God wanted, this is an if question, I'm not saying this is the way it should be. What if God wants men to be the center of some sort of strength in the household? Okay, so when it does come to lifting stuff, that's going to be your job, or something like that. And then let's take that strength. Now we've seen in here that strength and honor are not male traits, right? Those are female traits. They are descriptive of the highest female traits, so they're human traits. Strength is a human trait. But of the two, let's say let's pretend for a second that God does want the man to be in a leadership role. Let's say that's the case. If you're a young boy growing up and you have two parents, both of them good, godly parents, the mom is a real leader in the household, and the dad may be a leader, but let's say that he's he's got some job that you don't necessarily put on the high on the manly scale or whatever else, and that he's a fairly passive fellow. He's a quiet, introverted fellow. Is it the case that this child he's got a desire to see and be strong? Who does he imitate as his model? Right? So if he starts to imitate the obviously stronger of the two, the one that appears to be stronger, then he will adopt that. You ever seen a child adopt the speech of somebody else? They do this all the time. The way that they speak comes from the way their friends speak, or the way their cousins speak, or the way their parents speak, or whatever else. There's a reason kids grow up with the same accent you have. They're listening to how you talk, and they're imitating it. And it's the same, it's people publish all the time, our kid said the cutest thing. And what they really mean is, they said back to me the same thing that I've said to them, and they did it in a funny environment. They're just imitating you. So here's a principal imitator up to the age of 6. He's just imitating stuff. And as a boy, he wants to imitate, let's say it's the case, he wants to imitate strong. And that mama is most overtly strong. Then he starts imitating mama. Now, that means he's also imitating mama's speech patterns. And then he goes to school, and he's using mama's speech patterns. And what's some other little boy going to say to him? You're talking like a girl, or whatever, or you're a sissy or whatever. Now, the reason I say this is there are at least 3 cases that I know personally where exactly this happened. And it's not the case that it's wrong for mom to be strong. That's not my point that I'm trying to get across here. Where's the wrong part of this? Where did what I just say go wrong? The kid says to the son, because you're speaking like your mother speaks, therefore you are female, or you're like a female. That's where this went wrong. So I don't want, and then we turn around and convince these young men that, okay, well, you're effeminate, and if you're effeminate, you're not part of this group, you might be part of that group, and then here's this other group that opens their arms and says, come over here, we're like this, but they're not doing things God's way. Now, I'm telling this just so story, not because I think that that's the way that it happens all the time. It's not the way that it happens all the time. It may not even be the way that it happens most of the time. It may not be the way it happens at all. I'm saying here is a place where something that we know that is biologically true, children are imitators of parents, can lead in a society that values things wrongly to encourage the person to find their identity in something that's not theirs. That's all I meant to say. There were a couple of hands.
Yeah, I think part of our feeling accepted is part of our happiness. Like, we want to feel like other people respect us and that we belong to this society that we're a part of. And I think if your identity is in Christ, you kind of already have that feeling of acceptance. Like, you don't need anyone else's approval. You have God's approval. If you don't, and you don't have God's approval, now you look to the things in society to find that acceptance and approval for who you are. And part of a method to kind of say, okay, don't focus on, you know, where your acceptance is. Focus on, you know, if that person says you're doing this, then go to these people who will accept you for doing this, or
Right.
go to this group who will accept you for doing this. And you can go to all these other things and go down a million different rabbit holes until you don't find where your true acceptance is. And I think that's
I think that's just right, and I would add one thing to that we mentioned a little bit before. The acceptance is part of happiness, and happiness is, again, what people just seek. We just seek happiness. It seems to be the case. It's hard to argue at that point. It's almost it's not tautological, but it's like 1 or 2 steps away from that. If we're seeking happiness, again, my answer to the kid or the mother in California, this was news of several months ago or whatever, where she'd already started gender transitioning this kid at 6 or 7, right? And why was she doing that? Was she doing that in her mind because she really wanted to make this kid's life tough? She thought she was making him happy in the long run. This is what makes him happy. I'm going to encourage him to be happy in what he likes to do. My point to her and ultimately to the kid would be this. You're mistaken about what's going to make him the most happy. Let's plot out a couple of possible worlds where in one world he continues down this path. And then in another world, and like our friend who's happens to be lesbian, she's not happy. Like she'll tell you that. This is not the way that she wishes that it was. The question is, can it still be that way? I think I've talked about this story a little bit. It's worth mentioning. Again, back to the society side, I'll do the short version of it without identifying who she is. This was, again, a case of abuse where a trusted male figure who should have been a paragon of virtue was a predator and abused her for years. And worst, I don't know, complicatingly, abused her at an age where we would absolutely say that she could not provide consent. But the bottom line is she was rational. She has rational faculties. She could choose to participate or not participate in some sense. And so you can imagine all the complexities that arise from this, and none of them are to be good, which is why we make these statutory ages and so on. But at the end of the day, not only did that male figure abuse her for years, 2 things happen. One, when as my understanding, again, not from direct evidence or interaction, but that her father, when he found out, did not intervene or did not intervene strongly when he did. And secondly, when this was brought to society, they put the guy away for 8 years or 10 years or something like that in a minimum security prison or whatever else. And the rest of the society, he was not terribly strongly condemned in my mind. Now, I'm fairly extreme about this position. I think that men who do that ought to be killed. And so the fact that this guy wasn't drug out and strung up in public, when you are a young lady and you're confused about what was your role, what was wrong, whatever, and you watch society slay this man and say and not judge you, but instead say, that is the perpetrator, you are the victim, now let us restore you. Part of restoration is he's gone from the earth and can never hurt you again. Her father should have been horsewhipped as far as I'm concerned, if that story was true. I don't know that story is true. For the sake of argument, she should see that men failed to protect her. So I would simply say it this way, without even being an amateur psychologist, do you have any wonder that she has trouble trusting or depending in men to be her strong protectors, if that's what if and only if men are supposed to be strong protectors? No, the guys who we say should be protecting her did exactly the opposite. They exploited her. Why is she a lesbian? For good cause at this point. And you can understand why she believes that she's likely to find her happiness in the arms of a woman instead of a man. Entirely irrational belief set based on where she came from. The question on the nurture side here is that reparable? Not in a society that treats that evil that way. It's not. Absolutely not. Our society, have been the principal influence in making her a lesbian, not nature. She wanted to date guys. She started trying to date guys, all that kind of stuff. Had some difficulties, had some trust issues. Surprised? Shouldn't be. If she doesn't have trust issues, then she's got some sort of memory problem. Okay. I bring that up just because it's an extreme, difficult example that says when our society is as wicked as ours is, and it's codified as deeply as it is, you should expect these to arise. And that my belief of why this stuff has come to a head now, these are the natural outworkings of a society that does not recognize purpose this line, and doesn't draw the conclusions of happiness from this set. If this is true, then we will be happiest when we fulfill our purpose. There's a reason Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life sold as well as it did. People all over the world, religious and non-religious, are dying for purpose. Richard Dawkins says, we must make our own purpose. He doesn't say, what are you concerned with about purpose? You're free from that. Obviously, we all want purpose. So where do we find it?
So it's interesting, this week I had a conversation with a coworker. His dad was an Army psychologist, and homosexuality came up, and he was of the camp that, like, hey, you know, you're born that way, it is what it is. And so I shared with him the vignette that we discussed last time about how, like, seeing pornography at a very early age, you know, like, at least correlation, right?
Yes.
Like, not definitively causation, but correlation, so we got into about that. But I guess, I think from the story you just told, like, obviously this individual is a complete victim, and you can't condemn her for, you know, the outcome of where she's at right now, right? I think the danger right now, and this is a generalization, the danger right now, I think we've swung the pendulum in the other direction as a society to where, first, if I were in the LGBTQ community, I'd probably be a little upset because they're literally all one, this like heterogeneous population, you know, that kind of feels like they're the island of, you know, crazy toys. It's all lumped together, right? So there's that piece of it. But I think we've swung the pendulum in the other direction to the point where we don't want to, as a society, condemn anyone, right? And I think now a kid coming up, let's fast forward to now, and that individual is coming up now. Let's say that abuse never happened, right? If a kid's coming up in this day and age, they're like, wow, maybe I kind of feel this way, and it's like overly accepted. And I don't know any of this to be true, but like my concern is that like you would be a lot more open to swinging in that direction because there's really no repercussions for it anymore. I'm not saying we go back to the days of stoning people who were, you know, identified as gay, but I think we've swung the other direction now. And so in addition to folks who, you know, have bad stuff happen as kids that result in that style, but I think now we've got a population that's kind of like, well, I'm curious.
Okay, so then let me make a couple points based on this, because this raises a few issues. I'll bring up an experience of my own, and I'll bring up the movie, The Greatest Show on Earth. As people generally seen this is a Hugh Jackman movie where he's a Barnum and Bailey guy, I think. I'm in Portland, Oregon, which is a fairly liberal city, and like protesting is what they do for fun. It's like the entertainment around there. And I was a desperate motorcycle rider. I'm riding a Gixxer 600 in Portland where it rains 270 days a year. So that's commitment for you right there. And the bridges are serrated and metal. Cheese graters. I come out of the building and I get stopped and I'm not paying attention. I flip up my visor and I look, and it's I think either a gay pride parade or a lesbian parade, and these occurred. The sense I got was circus. Like this, the people in this march were not walking down the street in conventional clothes. They weren't walking down the street doing conventional things. They were specifically revolting against convention. They were being intentionally provocative and what some people would call offensive. Now, why would you do that? Let me bring up another reason why. You go to The Greatest Show on Earth, right? And Hugh Jackman walks around and he finds people that, what does society tell them they were? Freaks. What does Jackman tell them in the movie? You have gifts. You're special. And he draws them in together, and now they sing together and they hang around with each other. What have they become? Family. They are a family. They're a family of people. This was a guy who brought the freaks together, people who thought of themselves as freaks because society told them they were freaks. And he says, you freaks come with me and we will be a family of freaks. One of the reasons that you see, in my opinion, the extreme counterculture that you see in the gay community, in portions of the gay community, is because society's been telling them they're freaks and they have found their family. It's exactly like The Greatest Show on Earth, exactly like it. What the Christian response to this is not, we need to fix our society. It's not the right response. The right response in Christendom is, we also are building a family. And it is a family like your Greatest Show on Earth, like your lesbian community, your gay community, your LGBT community. We are building a community. And that community, it ought to be so attractive that when you're wandering around and you're like, I don't know who I am. I'm confused, I'm gender confused, I'm sex confused, I'm career confused, I'm purpose in life confused. And you walk into the first one and you look into the lesbian tent, so to speak, and see what the circus looks like in there. And you're like, all right, I'll hang around in here. Are they happy? You go into the gay tent. You go into the corporate America success tent. You go into the military tent. You go into the sports tent. Then you go into the Christian tent. If that Christian tent does not turn around and look like paradise, guess who's doing it wrong, at least if they're right? Does the gay community turn around and say, we are God's society where we are optimally doing exactly what God wants us to do and we will be maximally happily and joyful there? No, they say, we're just trying to make the most of what we can. And all of those groups do, but one group turns around and says, we are doing it God's way. God loves you and wants you to be as happy as you possibly can. If you do it God's way, you'll be as maximally happy and joyful as you possibly can be. You ought to look into that tent and be like, I have found paradise. And what's the first thing that you do when you look into that tent and you taste what's in there? What do? You run to the other tent and you say, you guys have got to come and see this tent. When Jesus does what he does, what do the people say? They run and they tell people, come and see the rabbi. Come and see the man who did this for me. The reason our society is like this is we, the salt and light of the earth, have not been salt and light. Now I'm preaching. I'm literally poking on the thing. When we in the church act like the church, when we are actually the kingdom of God, we will be so attractive to all these. No one's going to come in here and say, how dare you denounce the lesbian and gay community for blah, 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 blah. You know why? Because that's not what we're doing. We're saying, anybody outside the tent? You're going to be outside the tent. You want to be inside the tent? This is how you do it. Why you tell me I can't be, that I'm wrong to be gay? Because I don't believe that that's who you are. Who you are, you're not a gay man. You're not a lesbian female. You are one of God's children. Do you want to come and meet your Father? Off my soapbox, sorry.
I'll get on and agree. Because if you spend any time around the homosexual community, one thing I think portions of it that you'll find is very often they're better at hospitality than most Christian groups. You feel welcome immediately, a part of the family. Come to my house, eat with me. It's rare in church that I find groups that are as accepting. So that is a definite challenge because it does not feel to me like very often we do it as well as they do.
That's right. That's right. I think, I hate to say it, I don't hate to say it. This is the number one thing that we hold on to that we as the church shouldn't. And Jesus identified this like 80 different times. What was the number one topic Jesus talked about? Anybody remember? Was he mentioned more than anything else? Money. The rich young ruler, that guy he did a bunch of stuff that was good. He probably had a bunch of stuff Jesus could have been like, really? You lived all the commandments? How about, this one? He could have drawn on the ground again, and the guy would have been like, okay, well, maybe I haven't kept all the commandments since my youth. What did he tell this guy? Sell all you have, give to the poor. Not because being rich is wrong. Job, when God says you're the most righteous man on the planet, he was also filthy rich. And then what does he do to him after he's properly humble? Makes him like 2 times, 3 times as rich as he was beforehand, twice as rich as he was before. Rich does not equal bad, but you know what rich does equal? You start to depend on it, you start to become greedy, and you start to not remember that God is the source of your riches, and you trust in your riches instead of trusting in God. Part one that you do. But here's the point. We in the church, there ought to be nobody in the church who's needy, ever. So as soon as somebody is like, I'm having trouble making rent, my car's whatever, there should be like 5 people who are like, here's an extra vehicle, I'll sell my vehicle, get a cheaper vehicle, and we can both have a vehicle. I mean, that's the way it ought to be. The socialism that we decry and say that's the way, that how dare they, whatever else, should be voluntarily done by the church to such a degree that people sitting outside the church should say, those guys are a bunch of socialists over there. That's what the church ought to look like. We should be accused of being a bunch of red communists until they go poke into our tent and they're like, what do you guys believe? Workers control the means of production? You're like, no, God owns it all. Oh, okay, well, you're not communists then, are you? No, we're not communists. Well, you smell like communists. Well, sorry, it's not communism because you're taking it from me. It's communism because I'm giving it. And we give it because it's not ours, it's God's. So we should act, we in this room, you should look at the person across the room who you barely know and say, I love them as much as I love my own brother and sister. And hopefully you love your own brother and sister enough. Let's pretend your brother and sister aren't a jerk. Let's pretend that you actually like them. Because maybe that's the case in some, whatever. But let's pretend that you actually love them and you want them to succeed as much as you do. Would you not give them the clothes off your back? Would you not give them your car when you need it? Would you not invite them into your home to live with you until you can help figure out whatever the problem is? Would you not, in extreme, and hopefully you would, maybe you wouldn't even for family, if your own family is having difficulty and you live in a really nice house in Northern Virginia and you have to sell your house and move to a townhouse or a condo or a small apartment so that they also can have a place, if that's something that you're like, yeah, of course I would do that, we're family, that means you're closer to doing things the right way. Good Will Hunting, Robin Williams is talking to Matt Damon, and he says, he asks him some question about friends, and he mentions Ben Affleck or whatever, and he goes, no, he's not your friend. He'd lie down in traffic for you. He's family. Okay, so the poor in South Boston understand this. Now, they don't have as much to give, so to speak, but the bottom line is that whatever you need, that's what I got for you. Why are we not the same? The answer is we're not listening to our Lord, because our Lord says, do that. You're tweeting remotely. Congratulations. Whatever script you've got's working. Hopefully that script was not phrased in the form of a question. Yes, sorry, I saw a hand here, and then we'll go to Jeremiah.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you just said. I think, though, we've gotten a little bit bogged down in what I'll call the ontology of what it is to be male and female.
Yes.
And really, the Bible doesn't speak to that. It doesn't say that men have to be this way and women have to be that way. There is a sense of leadership, for sure, in men's roles, but you can also read even the scripture, the psalm that you spoke to, or you read. You could read that as the Lord reminding us of who we ought to be, because we do have different tendencies.
Yes.
We're reminded as men to love your wives. Why? Because I have a tendency not to.
Yes.
We're reminded as women to respect your husband. Why? Because women have a tendency not to, right? So does that mean there's a difference? No, I mean, men should respect their wives as well. So the ontology of what I'm trying to get to, the ontology of what it means to be a man and a woman gets messy when you're talking about specific roles and attitudes. But I think what we can say for sure is that there is a difference. And God created them man and female. Man and female, he created them in their likeness. It's both of them in their likeness. But there is a difference. And so, wow, what am I trying to say here? I kind of lost myself.
No, this is good. So let me hit some of what you're saying. And yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
One point. My point is to follow up on what you said a little bit earlier, and what Dr. Yuan would say, and I agree with him, is we've lost a sense of who we are in our gender roles. And that's a big mistake, because when we decide, I am a man because this, that, the other thing, or I'm a homosexual because this, that, that becomes my idol.
Yep.
That becomes who I am instead of a child of God. And that's a problem, and that's where we get into trouble talking about the moral aspect of what is your God. The last aspect is, for sure, the Bible says that homosexual activity is wrong. It also says that
It says some heterosexual activity is wrong.
also says that adultery is wrong.
Yes.
It also says that rape is wrong. All these things are wrong, but it doesn't actually say that struggling with attractions is wrong. Now, I'm not saying that's a great idea. What I'm saying is the ontology of what it means to be a man and woman really gets messy, and what the Bible and what God is telling us is, I've created you this way, and you need to trust in me to do
Yep.
the right thing, even when it's hard, because ontology of what it means, wow, that gets so messy because it gets into the nurture and it gets into societal roles and it gets into all these aspects. But I think for sure, whatever that is, there is a difference in that we can say, for sure. Does that make sense?
It does, and we'll see what she would like to add, and then I'll talk on that.
I always speak up about these
No, do it.
conversations. We spend so much time talking about bell curves. So there's a bell curve for men, and there's a bell curve.
So I haven't paid her to make this point, but this is exactly where I was going. Go ahead.
There's a bell curve for women.
Yes.
And the question, the whole thing that we get stuck on is how much distance between these bell curves?
Right.
Do they overlap
Right?
or are they huge?
How much do they overlap? Yeah, if so, yeah.
Why does it matter unless there is a moral reason that they need to be spaced like this?
So here's why, and exactly right. This is the point that I think that we ought to get to, and then I'll make my final point, and we can have a last couple minutes of arguing about it. The bell curves don't matter. That is not the way to make this decision. It might give us some clues, possibly, at best, but that's not the best place to look for clues. Okay. If we are human beings and are promiscuous, prolific classifiers, we overclassify everything that we possibly can to the degree that we tend to classify, like we've overclassified species that can interbreed, when the definition of a species is supposed to basically be it can interbreed. So, I mean, that's how bad we've gotten about it. The question is not, are there two curves and in which curve do I belong? That's the wrong question, as Katie points out. The right question is, what is God's purpose for my life? For Brian and Katie, it might look like something like this. Brian asked the question, am I to be a man? Am I to be God's man? Am I to be a man of a particular kind of man? What kind of man am I to be? Am I to be a man, a leader of this type? Am I to be a man, a follower of that? What am I supposed to do? And God says, if you want your classification system, I want you to be a leader. I want you to be a follower. I want you to be a provider. I want you to be a support person. I mean, why is he going to say this? Because depending on to whom he's relating, he will have been all of those things if he's a godly man. Sometimes he's a leader. Sometimes he's not. Sometimes, and in some roles, this person's a leader. In some situations, that person's a leader. And that changes all the time. Even in the military, even the de facto leader, you turn around, I lead a patrol. If I'm leading the patrol, am I watching where we're going? No, the point man does that. Am I navigating us from one point to the other? No, the second or third guy back, the navigator's doing that. Well, am I providing security for it? No, the two guys on the flanks providing security for it. Well, what am I doing? Honestly, I'm just traveling along to talk on the radio because all of my job was done when I selected and trained and ensured that those guys were ready and I provided the plan. Roll. Done. Once you're on patrol, your team, you had better be a passenger. If you're not a passenger on your patrol, you did a bad job doing something prior. God's answer to Brian is, in the same way that I said, when someone says, how old's the universe? Your answer ought to be, from which perspective? From what location? Or you don't understand the question. When Brian asked the question of, Lord, what kind of man, what do you want me to be? Who am I? He says, in relation to whom? Okay, well, first in relation to you, he says, you are my son. Katie asked the same question. He says, you are my daughter. So there, you've at least got two terms. One's a son, one's a daughter. There's a difference for you. But you're also different in a bazillion other ways. And he says, and Brian says, okay, well, who am I to Katie? And God says, I want you to be a loving husband to Katie and a loving father to your children. And Brian says, okay, well, what about specifics? And God was like, you know what? If you want the specifics, we can talk about it, but how about a general principle? Aren't you human beings always trying to find the general equation, the general principle that leads to it? Be a good father and husband. And Brian says, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you want me to be a strong motorcycle guy? Does that mean you want me to use chainsaws outside and cut down trees? Or does that mean you want me to clean toilets? Does that mean you want me cooking? And by the way, men are chefs, men are lumberjacks, men are janitors, men are all kinds of other things. What is God's answer back to Brian? Is he going to describe to him what his particular roles ought to be in there? What is he going to say? Be a father like I am a father to you. And it means that whatever the person needs, and watch what Jesus did. He sent his own son, who being in the very form of God, did not consider equality with God to be grasped, but taking on the form of a servant, slave. That means, Brian, if you want to know what it is in this particular situation, it might be slave. Oh wait, huzzah, I get to be a slave. Thank you, God. He's like, no, you're missing the point, right? So if we really want to distill this down to general principles, the answer is this. You're to be a father like God is to be a father. Katie says, well, wait a second, you're a father and you just told me I'm a daughter. I'm not supposed to be a father. What am I supposed to be? And he might say, you're to be a bride to him like you want all people to be a bride to Christ, or something like that, okay? Or he might say, I want you to act as a daughter towards one of my other sons who I've given you and you have been given to him, that kind of thing. So when it comes to the actual roles, I would say this. In my own marriage, it just so happens that I'm Mr. I'll make a decision guy, right? My wife is, I'll provide the different options. I don't want to make a decision. So in the decision-making process, if I ask, how do I love Tracy best? The answer is, know her so well that I know what she actually wants, and then provide the direction and execution order to go do, not what I want, but what she wants, and what is best for the family. And the idea is that if what she wants is not best for the family, I draw and lead her over to that one, and the opposite way. She draws and leads me over towards what's best for the family too. Both are leaders. Now, role-wise, let's say, are there roles that God has called out for men and women in there? I think, and I'm back to my one from a long time ago on the same subject, because we're back to a gender role question. I do think that in a special forces team, forget the family, in a special forces team, somebody's the captain. That doesn't mean he's the best guy. He's usually not. Doesn't mean he's the smartest guy. Frequently, he's not. It doesn't mean that he's the only one that can do that job. He's not. They get killed all the time, and somebody steps up in combat and does a better job than he was doing in the first place. What it means is he has been given that role. So to Brian and Katie, or to me and Tracy, better, I would say, God might say, when I have put you together, I have put Scott in this position where he's supposed to be the captain of the family. But if he acts like a captain who's standing or snapping orders and doing what's good for him, then he's doing it wrong, and he's an embarrassment to his profession. What he should be doing is acting like the Marine officer does. All the troops eat first, and then you eat if there's anything left over, kind of thing. And Jesus is the head of the church, right? When Jesus came to be the head of the church, what did he look like? What did he do? He's washing disciples' feet. He's healing. He's serving people. Okay, so be like Jesus, and then you'll be a good father. Be like Jesus, and you'll be a good mother. And it actually will divide out in the roles that you have for each other, that you would ask this question: what role should I take? This is the way I would say it. Consider your own marriages. What can I do that would make my partner the happiest, my husband or wife the happiest in this situation? That's what you should do, because that's the golden rule. That's the law that God has given us. And what you'll find is when you do that, it will divide along lines that actually turn out to have some gender specificity to it. Because when you say now, Katie's back to the curves, I think that what you'll find that when people act like that you'll find men typically are filling this role, and women typically are filling these sets of roles. When I say typically, I mean on average on this one. Not because that's who they are and have to be, but it is a function of the mind and soul that God has put in those bodies. And now that we're out of time, I'll say the most controversial thing I possibly can. I do think that part of who we are, our mind, our soul, and our will, whatever you think of those three things, whatever that core portion is. Or I'll point you to this one. I agree very much with J.R.R. Tolkien in his specification of, his description in that Silmarillion thing. It's not the Lord of the Rings stuff, it's this other mythology he created. And he talks about these angelic spirits that are the powers of the world, and some of them are male and some of them are female. They took on those forms because of some of the identity that they had of what they're good at and what they love. The female angelic forms are as powerful are more powerful than any of the men or elves or dwarves or anything else. They could kill them in a heartbeat. It's not that that in battle or something they're not as deadly kind of thing. It's this has to do with what kind of role that they would play, and the things that we think of sometimes when we think of them rightly: nurturing, loving, caring, supportive. That these are right and godly feminine traits. Now, should men also have those traits? Yes. But of the two, one of them will have those traits more strongly instantiated than the other. So do I think that there are gender roles? I think there are, but that they flow from the identity of the people. And this is very important right here too. This should actually in some way specify who you marry in the first place. So it may be the case that you find yourself in a marriage where you would say, had I to do it differently, now that I'm a Christian, I know that I would want somebody who has these other properties, but now I'm married to this other person. Okay, well then God's got a role for you how to interact that way. But hopefully I'm making sense. I'm realizing that's probably not terribly clear. But what I'll say is this, I do think that such roles exist. And I think that they exist as an outflow of who you are in relation to God, not in who society, it's 90% of what society says those roles are is wrong. And so go back to the scriptures and say, what do those properties look like? What should they look like? And consider, by the way, that a lot of what was done in scripture was done for the time and because of the people. Let me give you the last bit of evidence for that. Jesus says, is it lawful for me to divorce my wife? And Jesus says, it gives the response of, this is what you should do. And then they say back, but Moses said, give us a certificate of divorce. And Jesus replies, Moses let you do this because your hearts were hard, but this is not God's plan. Now I want you to listen to what just got said there. Moses put a law into effect that is not God's plan for all, from the beginning. That's not the way it was from the beginning. What Jesus is saying is, yeah, you live in this society, that's the way that it works, because you guys are being knuckleheads. If you live in the kingdom of God, knuckleheads are not supposed to be there. So do it the way God intended it. All right, that's not the way that it works. So you can't look at the Bible and says, well, it's a Mosaic law, therefore it's God's eternal law. If Jesus is right, that's not true. So now you have to go and study your father and watch his son and say, how is it God wants me to interact? And let me put this last bit way over time. As much of your thinking on this as is informed by your own pride, that thinking is wrong. I do not want to do the following things as a husband because it will cause me to suffer a loss of face or pride or respect or whatever else. All right, whatever you just thought about was wrong. I don't want to be a wife in this sense because if I'm supposed to tender respect or submission as one subordinate to a captain, a lieutenant or sergeant to a captain, I don't want to work for that jerk. All right, well, you're already wrong. You're already wrong. Whatever comes out of pride is wrong. Find out what comes out of love and humility, and then you'll be thinking in the right direction on all this. Okay. In short, in absolute one-sentence summary, be a part of a system, of a society, of a kingdom, where your role as your biological gender is irrelevant. You might be able to study it and say, okay, well, some percentage of them seem to be doing this that also have these traits. You know what? Some percentage of people in the kingdom of heaven who have red hair will be found to be doing certain things. That doesn't mean that red hair means that you need to be doing something particular, right? These are statistical analyses that do not inform your behavior as an individual. Be a part of the kingdom of God where your living is so radical that anybody who looks in your life says, I don't know what other societies there are, but that's the society I want to be a part of. And what that means is, and by the way, I'll openly say it here, that's not McLean Bible Church. That's not Reston Bible Church. We do not do this here. We do not, when you poke your head in a Reston, you do not turn around and be like, wow, the kingdom of God on earth. When you go into the small groups at Reston, you do not be like, well, this is it. This is what I've been missing my entire life. And when you come into solid ground, you don't say, this is the way that it absolutely ought to be. We are not doing this right, and I say we start doing it right. And if this was the class that started it, then we'll have to say thank you to Katie at the end of it. Okay, last comments now that we're over, because I've talked for too long. There's no way we'll exhaust this subject in dozens and dozens of these, but hopefully that gives us something to look at and ultimately be a part of the kingdom of God and let that inform who you are as an identity. And like we said earlier, all of this stuff boils down to identity. And identity is only given to you by God. Seek your identity from God, not from the society, not from a list, not from your own mindset of what it ought to be. Go find your identity from God, and then you won't have this kind of confusion. Like this guy. This guy's identity from God, at least for now, based on where he is today, is not go be a husband to this woman, as far as I can tell. apparently it's be a celibate speaker who talks about all this stuff. All right. There was one last hand. Yes, sir.
I was just going to mention the second half of the verse I sort of alluded to was love your wife as Christ loved the church and
Yes.
gave himself up for her.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty darn powerful when you consider it's not love your wife as Christ loved the church and lorded over her.
Right.
And gave her, talking about the servant.
Absolutely true. And I think what you'll find is that'll make you be and feel more manly than any amount of motorcycling or hunting can ever do. Okay. No solid ground. It's Easter. No solid ground next week. We'll see the time after that. We'll go back to Katie's list. I'll put out a survey of, I keep joking it's Katie's list, but of the things we've established as topics. You guys vote and pick your next topic, and we'll hit that one the next time. This week, I will say one thing about Easter week. When Jesus said, every time that you do this in remembrance of me, he, as best I can tell, was probably talking about the Passover meal. So we Christians tend to skip the Passover meal, a thing like, yeah, whatever, Good Friday, whatever. Pay attention this week to what Passover is to the Jewish nation. Pay attention to this yourselves. Understand what that is. We're not Jewish here, so God didn't rescue us out of Egypt. But that, of course, as Paul points out, is a metaphor for all this stuff. So what I would ask you to is this week, spend more time on Easter thinking about the setup for Easter and not just the stuff that we always talk about, because the stuff we always talk about makes the most sense in context of that.
And if you need help cooking.
And if you need help cooking, he's your man. Thank you all very much. Sorry to run over so far, but thank you very much for your time and attention.